Hey everybody, hey, it's Mr. Forster again. Let's see, let me go ahead and share my screen. So here we go. So this is chapter 2, installing OpenSUSE. You know, you did chapter 14 first, which was to figure out what your configuration checklist needs to have, the minimum system requirements, recommended system requirements and stuff. Now you get into the chapter that really says, hey, you're ready to do the install. Now, I've included a couple of install videos in the weekly email to you, but I just thought I would give you just the overview of this chapter. So chapter 2 is installing OpenSUSE, okay? And again, it's very similar for a lot of Linux distributions that are out there. You know, there's going to be initial check your system configuration. So when you launch the install process, the OS is going to sit there and say, hey, let me double check. You may have made a checklist. I need to know for real, and actually go through it. You know, Windows does the same thing to make sure that the hardware, everything is there, all the requirements are being met, okay, for the minimum installation. Or else it's going to say, hey, you don't have enough space, or you don't have the right configurations to be able to do this. And again, you're probably using, I know I'm using stuff, VMware and stuff, to be able to do this, just to kind of match it out. Or like what I do, I also have removable drives, okay? So there's a process here of kind of walking you through VMware. I've already kind of walked you through that ahead of time already. So go figure. In the installation of the VM, okay, again, you could use VM, you can use VirtualBox, you can use a number of ones, but I think that VM is probably your best bet. You're going to do the installation process, right? It's going to go through and check languages and videos and sort. Again, this will look a lot like what Windows does, Microsoft does in this process, okay? Anyway, so when you go through that process, it's going to probe your system, right? It's going to make sure that you have any kind of partitioning. For this one here, I would just recommend just accept all the defaults. Keep in mind that when you're installing this, you're installing an VM. If you were installing this on a real drive, it's going to perhaps either put it side by side or wipe out what you got there. So make sure you pay attention as to where you're installing this and what you could risk, okay? I always recommend people initially, if they have the ability to have removable drive systems, it's a little bit cleaner, okay, because they don't risk their other drive, okay? But if not, then make sure you're doing this inside of VMware, because you are working at your own risk. If you do it inside of VMware, you stay inside that virtual environment, you're usually pretty good, okay? But if you're not paying attention and you install it, you could wipe out your system. So just keep that in mind. A little risk involved here, okay? But that's up to you. Really, when it comes down to it, we're all adults. We got to accept our responsibilities for what we're doing, which means we got to pay attention, okay? So installation stuff is going to go through this process to be able to set up and install. Let me see if we get back. When it's done, it's going to configure and say, here's all the stuff. It's going to ask you for what's going to be your administrative username and password, to be able to do that. I suggest that when you're doing this for an R&D, make your username and password pretty simple and for you to remember, okay? And then the last part of this chapter is going to deal with the desktop environment. There's two primary desktop environment. One's called Genome and the other one, or GNOME, and the other one is called KDE. They're basically the same. They're graphical user interfaces, okay? The difference is that how much is on the desktop in terms of icons, and then the taskbar, what it looks like. That's your Genome, your GNOME right there. And then you have, of course, like file managers, whatnot. And then here is like your KDE. And KDE, I think, looks a little bit more like Microsoft, okay? Because it has like the gecko down there, like the start button or whatever. And then menus come off the bottom a little bit more traditionally, whatever. But again, that's up to you. I would recommend that you use KDE to start. Okay, and again, it's going to go through and says, hey, what's an operating system? Because remember, this is an introductory book, so it doesn't assume that you know anything about operating systems. So it's got to lay the foundation and saying, hey, this is a graphical interface. These are icons. This is what an icon represents. This is the file manager. All the stuff that you probably have now, take pretty much for granted. So you should be able to blow through this relatively easy as a realm. Later on, you're going to have the chapter where you're going to look at X Windows, and it gives you the ability to make your own graphical user interface. Though I don't think I've met a single person who's actually made their own X window, but I gave you a couple of videos on how that works, just in case you have some curiosity on it. Okay, so the overall feel for chapter 2 is really just about installing OpenSUSE or installing a Linux distribution. If you're going to install Ubuntu or Mandrake or Mint or something like that, you could probably find some decent ones out, videos and stuff out there on the web. It's always good to watch some stuff before you do it, because maybe it gives you a heads up of what you might encounter. So hopefully that just kind of helps. Let me stop sharing and I'll end the recording. So you guys have a great day.